I've been talking a bit about how depression and related problems get started, and I've been focusing on risk factors, genetics, isolation, medication side effects, inactivity, and so on. And we can extend this idea to anxiety-related problems too. A snake escapes the zoo and swallows half your leg before it's pulled off you, and now you're afraid of snakes. But there's a way in which these psychological phenomena differ from most medical illnesses, and I'd like to show you how. First, let's start with an obvious illness that you've probably had, the flu. Well, you know what causes it, a virus. So a virus causes the flu, and as a result, you have symptoms. And you probably know that at least some of the symptoms aren't from the virus. They're from your body's attempt to fight back. Let's give them a fever, and maybe the virus won't replicate as much. Let's produce lots of mucus to shed the virus. Let's make them throw up in case it's food poisoning. So the symptoms, they're essentially endpoints in the sequence. The virus comes along, you get the flu, and then you get symptoms. And there we go. Depression and anxiety are different in a particularly pernicious way. We have causes or risk factors, just like the flu, and maybe you get depressed as a result. The depression will bring on symptoms. Most people, for example, get sleep disruption. They can't sleep, they wake up through the night, they're restless, and they get early morning awakening and can't get back to sleep. So far, so lousy. Same as the flu, pretty much. But in depression, the symptoms don't remain symptoms. They become new causes. If we take a non-depressed person and give them the crummy sleep of a depressed person for long enough, they can begin to show some of the signs of depression. So the depression causes a sleep problem, but then the sleep problem feeds back and makes the depression worse. And remember, depression does cause sleep problems. So the worse depression is, it makes the sleep problem even worse, which makes the depression worse, which makes the sleep problem worse, and so on, and it all becomes a vicious cycle. The symptoms tend to spiral. A similar thing happens with anxiety. Something makes you anxious, and anxiety shouts out one message, loud and clear to you. Get out of here. Avoid. And that's a good evolutionary adaptation, but it gets set off when you're not in real danger. So what happens then? Well, if you avoid, you immediately feel better, which is a little reward for avoiding. And that makes avoiding more tempting next time. A little part of your brain also looks at your behavior and says, hey, she's spending an awful lot of energy running away from that thing. It must be really dangerous. And so you wind up getting more and more afraid. So the anxiety causes avoidance, and the avoidance magnifies the anxiety, and the problem can start to spiral, just like in depression. And in anxiety, this avoidance anxiety spiral is the key one. Not so, though, in depression. In depression, it's worse. I mentioned the sleep spiral, but what else? Well, depression also produces inactivity, and inactivity appears to promote depression. It usually impairs concentration, which can impair work performance, which gets you more negative feedback, which can promote the depression. It saps energy, which means that you withdraw and stay home more, but social withdrawal tends to promote depression, which makes withdrawing even more tempting. So there's more than one snowball happening here. Here's a list of some of the main depressing snowballs, or if you like, spirals. So the difference between depression and some other physical illnesses is that the symptoms become new causes and keep the problem rolling. Same for anxiety. So, okay, that's discouraging. What does that mean for treatment? Well, for one thing, it means that when we're trying to change things, we need to focus on symptoms as well as on original triggers. So maybe job loss put a person over the line and the depression started rolling. And that resulted in let's say, a sleep problem. It's tempting to say, oh, the sleep problem, that's just a symptom. You don't need to focus on it. If you resolve the work issue, the sleep will take care of itself. But that's actually not usually true in depression. Once the person is in a therapist's office, the sleep problem may be huge. And if they get a new job, they're not going to be able to do it. So we have to look at the sleep issue, even if it wasn't the original cause. There's a second issue, and this is a positive aspect. There's one nice thing about spirals. They work in both directions. If we can get the sleep a little bit better, they'll have a tiny bit more energy the next day, and they'll be able to concentrate a little bit more. Not much, but a little. But they might get a tiny bit more done and feel a little bit better about the day. And that may help them get to sleep a minute earlier and stay asleep a minute longer. None of those effects is huge. They may not even be noticeable. But as the sleep gets better, bit by bit, it can have spin-off effects against the depression and against those other symptoms. I slept slightly better last night. Maybe I can go for a bit of a walk today, and having had some exercise, I might sleep even a little bit better tonight. And just as the depression got worse, bit by bit, thanks to a depressing spiral, it can begin getting better the same way. And eventually, these tiny, ridiculous spin-off effects can begin to pick up speed, and the spiral begins moving faster, and they begin pulling up out of the depression. The trick is to pick a few bits of the problem and try to get the spiral moving a little bit in the opposite direction, and to help the person tolerate that early period where they're not getting very much improvement. In the case of anxiety, it's the same. We don't try to get rid of all the avoidance at once. That's usually an impossible task. Instead, we identify small, tolerable, and seemingly insignificant bits of the avoidance that we can chip away. The fear drops a tiny amount, so tiny the person may not even notice, and we can chip away the next bit. Eventually, the speed picks up, and you start making quite significant gains. We tend to spiral into these problems. In my experience, that's usually how people get out of them, too. You can get How to Be Miserable from your local bookseller or from Amazon. The link's below.